Now this evening we're going to look at the man often called the father of British empiricism. It's called British empiricism because all the famous ones were in Britain. And of course he is not really the first. Bacon and Hobbes preceded him in the modern world among others. The man I mean is John Locke, 1632 to 1704. So he was 18 when Descartes died. He's contemporary with Spinoza actually, so we're backtracking slightly to pick up this school. Now Locke was a strong advocate of reason. All men have it, he held. All men have the capacity to learn the facts. They have the capacity to agree, and they must always follow reason. We must be objective. We must not let our passions or our prejudices sway us. We must go by the evidence scrupulously, factually, impartially. Now, I should say that Locke does make appropriate overtures to the religious camp. He is himself a deeply religious Christian and wrote a great deal in defense of Christianity. But he does draw a clear line between faith and revelation on the one hand and reason on the other. And in philosophy, only reason counts. And we can therefore simply ignore the faith side of Locke this evening. But it's there. He is a deeply religious man. Now, in this general pro-reason attitude, understood in the widest sense, Locke is very similar to the rationalists. Now, this pro-reason attitude lasted among philosophers until the time of human Kant. And it was at that point that the consequences of all the different definitions of reason caught up to philosophers. Now, usually it takes 50, 75, 100 years for the practical results of a philosophy to manifest itself. Kant died in 1804. By the mid-19th century, reason culturally was on its way out altogether. And of course, you can look around you today to see what happened by the mid and late 20th century. Nevertheless, at this point in time, we're still in the 17th century, we're in a very pro-rational period. And you must understand this, otherwise you will never grasp why the 17th century is called the Age of Reason, or the 18th century the Enlightenment. We now see the disasters implied in their philosophies. Obviously they didn't. And so everybody at this period, with a few exceptions, but all the major figures, are still confident about the power of reason. The rationalists and the empiricists. They differed, of course, in their theory as what reason was and how it operated, but they did not differ about the fact that reason is an absolute and that we must accept it as against dogma, emotion, prejudice, etc., which was, of course, in itself a very important attitude shaping cultural developments. But we are in pure philosophy in this course. Well, let us pick up Locke now. We must, he says, use the right method in philosophy. Everybody, you know, is emphasizing the method since the Renaissance. We must, he says, first inquire into the nature and powers of the human mind. Find out what it is and isn't fitted to deal with, what rules it must follow. And the first thing we have to establish is that the mind at birth has no innate ideas, no knowledge. It is a white paper and dark chamber, an empty cabinet, a tabula rasa. What writes on the paper or fills the cabinet or illuminates the chamber? Only experience. Now, Locke devotes the first book of his famous essay concerning human understanding to an all-out polemic against innate ideas. Here are a few typical arguments that he offers. It had been argued by some philosophers that there are certain ideas universally accepted by all men, and this must prove they were innate. Locke answers that doesn't prove anything of the kind. If there are universally accepted ideas, that could derive from the fact that the fact in question is so obvious that nobody could escape it. It doesn't have to show that it was born innately. Moreover, he says there is really no universal agreement. Even on such a thing as the law of contradiction, he says. It isn't true that everyone agrees. Savages, imbeciles, babies have never even heard of it. They're not even conscious of the law of contradiction. Well, of course, the innate idea advocates came back with, well, of course they aren't conscious yet. You have to come to the stage of reason in order to grasp that you have those ideas. Locke answers, well, that's true for all ideas. Are they all innate then? Why do we have to discover them if they're innate? As for moral ideas, he says, there is no universal agreement even among adult civilized men. Locke is not a relativist in ethics. There are such things as correct ideas in ethics, but they require proof. And if they need to be proved, he says, they are not innate. Even the idea of God is absent from some people, and it differs from tribe to tribe and group to group. So much for the idea that there are universally accepted ideas which must therefore be innate. Moreover, he argues, to call an idea innate is usually a way of trying to protect it from criticism. These rationalists come in and say their innate ideas come from God, and therefore if you challenge their innate ideas, they make a big noise about this as an attack on God. This is wrong, says Locke. It simply amounts to entrenching your prejudices under the protection of the Almighty. You take your arbitrary subjective views and masquerade them as a word from on high. We have to give up this. We have to establish our principles by an appeal to the facts as we experience them. Another argument he gives of a quite different type. Moreover, he says, even suppose we were born with certain innate ideas, the ones that the rationalists make such a big fuss about would be useless to us even if we had them. For instance, he says, suppose we were born with such an innocuous idea as what is, which of course is another formulation of existence exists. What have you got when you've got that, says Locke? You can't deduce any concrete facts from it anyway. Now, I just interject here. We'll see whether Locke needs this or not as he goes on. But here's already at the outset a typical modern empiricist scorning broad abstractions as essentially irrelevant and useless. Now, you see, I've left out many of his arguments, but you see that his arguments are very uneven. And the rationalists could and did answer them all one way or another. Leibniz wrote a whole work called The New Essays on Human Understanding, specifically to refute Locke. Locke left out the single crucial argument against innate ideas, namely that an innate idea is a contradiction in terms. An idea is a form of awareness of reality. An innate idea would be an awareness of reality prior to any contact with reality, which is obviously an impossibility. But you'll see soon why Locke didn't and couldn't use this argument. In any case, he establishes to his satisfaction that man is born tabula rasa. And now he says, I will prove to you positively that we get all ideas from experience. How? Well, I will undertake to show for any idea you name how it has its ultimate sources in experience. And if I can do this, of course, that will cut the ground out from under the advocates of innate idea. Now, for Locke, there are two basic sources of experience, and only two: outer and inner. By outer, he means the five senses. Sensation is his name for the faculty of sense perception. By inner, he means what we would today call introspection, the faculty of looking into the content of your own consciousness. His term for that, by the way, is reflection. Reflection for him does not mean a process of abstract thought. It means what we mean by introspection. So there's only two sources of experience: sensation and reflection. These two are the only ultimate source of all our ideas and concepts, no matter what. From virtue to God to art to the theory of relativity, if you knew about it. There's no other possible source. Now, some people objected and they said, surely we don't get every concept from experience. What about Centaur, for instance, or Golden Mountain? We couldn't get these concepts from experience. Locke says, well, of course, what we get from experience are the basic, irreducible building blocks out of which all our other concepts are later constructed or compounded. We may never, for instance, have seen a white circle, But we have seen circles, and we have seen white. So we can put the two together in our mind and get the idea of a white circle. But in that sense, the idea of a white circle still comes ultimately, its constituents come from experience. What we get from experience are the irreducible components of all our later ideas. We get, in effect, the atoms of knowledge from experience, and we then build up the compounds. Now, Locke's name for these atomic ideas, using the traditional terminology, are simple ideas. And simple, as you know in philosophy, means simply indivisible, irreducible. A simple idea is an idea which can't be reduced to constituents, an irreducible unit which you have to experience directly in order to understand. From sensation, for instance, all of the following, and there's many more, are simple ideas: red, green, hot, cold, bitter, sweet, rough, smooth, moving, rest, space, extension, unity, existence, etc. And many more. All of these are simple. No mind, says Locke, can invent or construct one such simple idea. They come straight from experience, and without the necessary experience, you cannot understand the idea. If you were, for instance, congenitally deaf, the word loud would simply remain a noise to you. You have to be able to hear, and then you say, oh yes, loud, I know what that is. From reflection or introspection, we grasp all the states and activities of our own minds: willing, feeling, reasoning, pleasure, pain, judging, perceiving, remembering, etc. In other words, the mind acts on its simple ideas, and by introspection we can observe those actions. And again, we must experience these ideas, these internal ideas, these ideas of our own inner actions, if we're to understand them. If you have never in your life felt a pain or anything approaching it, the word pain will simply be a mystery to you. You don't know what it stands for. No one can invent a simple idea. Imagine, for instance, I told you, invent the taste of roast buffalo. You just can't do it. Now, if I told you it's 1 part pineapple and 3 parts banana split, well, you could maybe do it. But if it's a simple idea, you have to taste it to know. Now, besides simple ideas, there are complex ideas built out of simple ideas. In other words, the mind for Locke is not simply passive, it's active. From a small stock, a comparatively small stock of simple ideas by various operations, we can produce an endless quantity of ideas. Now, this shouldn't surprise you. In principle, the piano has how many keys, the modern piano? 88, isn't it, with the black and white? And yet the whole wealth of piano music comes from those 88 simple units combined in all the different ways. Well, similarly, the whole fabric of our knowledge comes from a handful of simple ideas put together in various ways. Now, there are 4 mental operations we use, according to Locke, to make complex ideas out of simple ones. One is repetition. We can simply repeat a given idea over and over. For instance, 1, 1, 1, 1. And if you do it 12 times, you get the idea a dozen. Simple enough. Or secondly, we can compare 2 or more simple ideas, view them side by side, and grasp their relationship. And that's how we get the idea bigger, or to the left of, and so on. Or 3, we can combine simple ideas. For instance, we can observe in this cigarette, one simple idea would be its whiteness, and one would be its hotness, and one would be its smoothness, and we put them all together to form cigarette. That is combination used to form the complex idea cigarette. And finally, says Locke, we can abstract. Abstraction he defines as the separating of one idea from all those which accompany it in reality. And that's the source of general ideas. So, for instance, we look at a number of men and we pull out or separate the idea of rationality and animality. And we thereby form the general idea rational animal, or man in general. Now, I don't want to go into this evening into Locke's theory of abstraction, because it's complicated and unnecessary for this course. Obviously, his theory of abstraction is going to be crucial for his theory of universals. And without going into details, I'll just say the following boldly. Locke's theory of universals is a very confused mixture of different elements. There is a certain Aristotelian element in his writings in regard to universals. But there's also a very strongly, dominantly, a nominalist element. Now, if you have to classify him, I would say on the whole, and with appropriate exceptions, Locke is a nominalist on the theory of universals. He does not really believe in the Aristotelian concept of abstraction. He does believe that existence possesses real natures, real essences. Now that makes things what they are, and that explains the properties of things. To that extent he follows Aristotle. But, he adds, the real essence of a thing is unknowable in most cases. All we can know are the essences that we arbitrarily create by our linguistic practices. The Hobbesian essences. Remember the nominal essences that I introduced under Hobbes and which all nominalists subscribe to. Now you'll see the results of this mixture in Locke shortly. But in sum, there's grave trouble in Locke on the theory of universals. And since you hear that there's a large element of nominalism and you remember Hobbes, as I hope you do, you will expect a definite skeptical element in Locke. And if you expect it, you won't be surprised when you hear about it. In any event, let us go on. I want to look more closely at the process I referred to a moment ago, the process of forming compound ideas of entities, material entities, what Locke calls material substances. Material substances. Now, Locke assumes that experience gives us directly only isolated simple ideas, separate sensory qualities, in effect. And so we ask the question, how do we arrive at the concept of integrated entities? And he answers, apparently obviously, well, we observe that certain qualities, certain simple ideas, go together constantly in our experience. And we therefore come to associate these qualities together in our minds as one unit, one entity. So we build up entities, or ideas of entities, by an active mental process of synthesizing, or uniting, or combining in our minds a set of coexisting simple ideas. So, for instance, I observe this cigarette. One simple idea would be cylindricality. And that I notice when I touch it goes along with smoothness. And that I notice when I put my finger at the tip goes along with the hotness. And that when I look at it goes along with the whiteness, and so on and so on. There's a whole cluster of such ideas, and I observe them going together repeatedly, and at a certain point I say, I'm going to give a name to this cluster of coexisting qualities. That's a cigarette. And thus I get the idea of an entity, a material substance, a thing, a cigarette. Now, this account led Locke immediately into an obvious question. The obvious question is, what keeps the qualities of the cigarette, well, he didn't use that example, but in any entity, what keeps the qualities of a thing together? What makes this one unified entity? Why don't the qualities float off? Why, for instance, don't we have a little cylindrical white patch over on the left, which has no texture at all, so when you go to touch it, there's nothing there, and no temperature, no burning point. And over on the right, meanwhile, when I put my finger there, I get a burn. Only all that's there is the hot, without the little white cylinder. And in front of me, I feel the smoothness, and there's nothing else there, and so on. Now, this doesn't happen, says Locke. But why? Is there any necessity in these coexisting qualities staying together? Well, he says there must be something which holds them together. An entity, a material entity, must consist of something over and above its qualities. There must be some kind of support or bearer And this phenomenon he calls the substratum, S-U-B-S-T-R-A-T-U-M, the substratum, which means the spread under. It is in effect like a metaphysical pincushion, or like a metaphysical glue, in which all the various qualities are stuck and which keeps them all together. Now, says Locke, we can draw support for such a thing as a substratum over and above the qualities from our ordinary language. If I say to you, for instance, what qualities does this cigarette have? Notice I say the cigarette has the quality of whiteness, cylindricality, heat, smoothness, etc. Well, if it has them, it must then be something over and above the qualities. It must be the thing which possesses all of these qualities. And therefore there must be something over and above the qualities, the substratum in which they inhere, which binds them together, which possesses them, which makes it all together one thing. Well, what are the qualities of the substratum? What are the characteristics of the substratum in itself? Well, you should see immediately that it cannot have any characteristics in itself. Because if it had any qualities, the immediate question would be, what keeps those qualities together? And we'd have to have a substratum to keep the substratum stuck together, and so on and so on. The substratum, says Locke, and every material entity has this phenomenon, the substratum is, quote, something I know not what, unquote. Something I know not what. Now, he says, much as I appreciate Descartes that we must have clear and distinct ideas, this happens to be a confused and indistinct one, he says. But nevertheless, it's a necessary idea, because we can make sense of material substances without a substrate. Now, for those of you who remember Aristotle's prime matter, that little uncharacterizable nothing in particular on which all forms are imposed, this is it showing up again in Locke in the form of the substratum. It's the cousin of Aristotle's prime matter. In fact, it's almost the daughter, or son, I guess. Now, just to make it worse, or fill it out, Locke is a dualist like Descartes. He's not an idealist or a materialist. He believes in two kinds of substances, material and spiritual. Minds, souls, cells. And he applies exactly the same analysis to spiritual substances. What, he asks, unites all the activities of a mind into one entity? What is the you? We say you think, you dream, you imagine, you will. Well, what is the you that performs all these activities, which binds them all together, which makes it one entity rather than just a disparate stream of activities? Well, there must be, he says, something which has all those mental attributes, which performs all those. The I, the you, and that is the substratum. And again, it is something, I know not what, which sticks your mental properties together. Now, just to fill it in, of course, Locke believing in God, he also says God is a big, cosmic, infinite substance, and so on this respect, it's like Descartes. Now, I want you to remember Locke on substance. I'm not going to criticize it now. Berkeley and Hume did quite well by criticizing this doctrine. You should simply see that in this respect, Locke is no empiricist. Because if you're going to go on the basis of experience, you cannot possibly justify the idea of something I know not what. But if you reject it, as Berkeley did partially and Hume did completely, you're back to Locke's question, what keeps all the qualities together? Why doesn't the universe simply disintegrate? To which Hume said, it does all the time. But we'll wait till we get there. Now let us sketch in Locke's metaphysics. What is the first thing we can know to exist, going in order? Well, you might say, since Locke is an empiricist, he must believe that the first thing you know to exist is the physical world. If you think that, you'll be disappointed. According to Locke, the first thing we can know to exist, the self-evident primary with which philosophy begins, is your own mind, your own self. Of that, we have a direct intuition, he says, using that in Descartes' sense, a direct self-evident knowledge of the self. He simply repeats Descartes' cogito. That the self, he says, the mental self, the mind, is the most certain thing of all. And thus Locke is a firm advocate of the prior certainty of consciousness, and in this respect a thorough follower of Descartes and Augustine. What comes next? Do we at least go from the self to the material world? No. You have to remember that Descartes is not called the father of philosophy for nothing. Remember where Descartes went after the self? To God. So does Locke. The next thing is God, he says. If we get the self by direct intuition, direct self-evidency, we get God by demonstration, by deduction. And he proceeds to offer a standard proof of God which isn't worth discussing. It amounts to I exist, I must have had a cause. Since I'm a thinking being, the cause must have been very powerful. It must itself have been a conscious being. And in effect, he finally reaches the idea that there's a being who is the source of all existence, all thought, and so on, and that is God. That's a quick run-through of that argument, but it has no value. So God is the next certainty after the self. And according to Locke, we can be more certain that there is a God than of anything else outside of us, except for ourselves. Here again, he's a straight follower of Descartes. Well, you say, what about the material world? Locke certainly believed in it after all. He's an empiricist. He believes in material substances. Well, I've been saving the truth for you. We don't, according to Locke, perceive the material world. We do not directly perceive the material world. What we directly perceive is only ideas in our own minds, experiences, sensations in our own minds. Again, you see, a pure Cartesian position, and it was taken for granted by all Descartes' followers. Consciousness is a self-contained, locked-in entity which contemplates only its own experiences, its own ideas. Well, if you ask Locke, as we asked Descartes, how do you know then that there is an external material world? Locke would say with Descartes, well, it's obvious that we don't create our own experiences because they are not subject to our will. We can't get rid of them by an act of will. Well, suppose we say, how do you know they're not all a dream? A dream is involuntary. When you're in the middle of a dream, you can't get rid of it by an act of will. Well, Locke says no. Material reality must exist as the cause of our experiences. We don't perceive it, so we have to infer its existence, but it must exist as the cause of our experiences. Well, how do you know, Berkeley asked, that God doesn't cause our experiences in us directly, and there is no material world at all? Locke's answer to that, after a fair amount of equivocation, amounts to this: oh, nobody can really be that skeptical. Now, why they can't, given his philosophy, is a big unanswered question. You see, he's in a worse position than Descartes here. Descartes at least had an innate guarantee that God is good, and therefore if he had a clear and distinct insight that there was a material world, okay, if you accept his epistemology. But Locke is an empiricist. Now, how can an empiricist verify an unperceivable reality? Well, obviously he can't. And therefore, it's not going to be very long before there is no reality for the empiricists. In other words, Locke had all the problems that we have seen with the causal theory of perception. Now remember what the causal theory is. Reality is the cause, but not the object of our experience. We don't directly perceive reality, only its effects on us. Reality we have to reach by inference, and Locke accepts this for the same reason that Descartes and Hobbes and Spinoza and all the rest did. Can we know the nature of reality, you ask? Yes, says Locke. Our experiences resemble, or copy, or represent the things out there in the world. So that although we are caught up in our own little world of consciousness, it happens that our little world of consciousness corresponds to or represents what's out there. And therefore Locke subscribes not only to the causal theory of perception, but the representative theory of perception. Now, of course, he does not believe that all of our experiences represent reality. Only one part of them. Locke is the one who christened the primary-secondary quality distinction. He's the one who introduced those terms. In the primary qualities, he includes all the standard ones plus solidity, because he wanted to distinguish it from empty space, you see. The primary qualities, he says, actually resemble true reality as it actually is. The secondary qualities are merely like the pain we experience when we put our hand in the fire. They are the effects on us of what's out there, but they do not represent real qualities in the object. They are subjective. And his arguments are the standard ones. You can conceive matter without the secondary qualities, not without the primary. The secondary vary from person to person, the primary are invariant, etc. Now you see that Locke's views on the senses and on the physical world, in essence the three strands, the primary-secondary quality distinction, the causal theory of perception, the representative theory of perception, all of these repeat the conclusions we've already seen in Hobbes, Descartes, and others. You can be prepared, therefore, to expect the worst possible result in future philosophy. Here is an empiricist, an advocate of common sense, accepting all the doctrines which lead to the unknowability of physical reality. Now, if the empiricists accept this, along with the rationalists, you can expect that it won't be very long before reality exits altogether from the philosophic scene. And that is what Berkeley and Hume between them achieved, if you call it an achievement, and that's what we will see next week. Now I want to turn to a final aspect of Locke's epistemology and metaphysics. He also believes in the necessary contingent dichotomy among truths. Now, he does not characteristically express it in these terms. For those of you who have read the essay, you'll know that he distinguishes 4 different types of proposition. But I won't bother you with that kind of detail. The necessary contingent dichotomy is what it comes down to in essence. On the one hand, we have those propositions which we can establish by Descartes' methods, by direct self-evidence or deduction from the direct self-evident. Now, these propositions, says Locke, are eternal, necessary truths. They are absolutely certain, and we can see why they must be true. On the other hand, there are the propositions which we establish by observation, sense experience. And in these cases, says Locke, we do not get any necessity. We simply observe brute facts. Such and such qualities happen to exist as our senses report. Such and such qualities happen to coexist together as our senses report. So there are, in effect, the necessary truths established by reason versus the contingent truths established by the senses, a dichotomy which by now you should be used to. Now let us turn for a moment to the necessary truths, the truths established by reason. What is Locke's view of their status? Well, to make a long story short, Locke wavers with regard to the interpretation of these. Part of the time, he suggests a typical rationalist view, that the necessary truths represent eternal laws of reality, necessary principles which even God can't violate. Part of the time, however, more of the time, insofar as he's a nominalist, he takes a typical Hobbesian view, that necessary truths are simply the results of our linguistic decisions, our semantics, our nominal definitions. And therefore, they don't tell us anything about reality. They merely express the way we use words, so that they're conventional, arbitrary, semantic, etc. In effect, Locke on this question is a thoroughly inconsistent mixture of Hobbes and Leibniz. You see what an eclectic Locke is. He picks pieces from the most opposed philosophies and sticks them together, even though they're diametrically opposed to each other. This approach, by the way, is called British common sense. Now, turning to the truths that are established by sense experience, the contingent truths, can we ever, asks Locke, reach complete certainty in their case? And in essence, his answer is no. At best, we can only achieve probability in regard to the truth learned by the senses. That's his dominant view. Why? Well, consider a typical example. Suppose you consider gold and the properties of gold. Now you observe that gold, I mean the ordinary element, combines a series of qualities which go together repeatedly in our experience. It's metallic, it's yellow, it has very great weight, it behaves in various ways when combined with other substances, and there's a whole list of separate properties you can rattle off. Well, says Locke, we observe that these qualities coexist repeatedly in our experience. Now, he says, can we ever understand why these qualities go together? And this is typical of anything from the senses. His answer is no. We cannot never understand why these qualities go together. We can see that, in fact, they do go together, but we have no means to know that they must go together, nor therefore to be sure that they will go together in the future. Now, he says, if we could grasp the real essence of gold, as Aristotle had thought we could, then we could see how all the properties follow from the essence. We could see why gold must have the properties it does, and our knowledge would be certain and necessary. But, says Locke, and in this part he's a real nominalist, we can't grasp real essences. All we can grasp is nominal essences. In other words, we simply decide arbitrarily to call a certain cluster of coexisting qualities by the same term, and we thereby create the phenomenon gold. Gold doesn't express a real necessary union of properties out there in the world. It is merely our human subjective classification. And since we see no necessary connection among the properties that we have jointly labeled gold, we see only that they happen to go together, but we're unable to grasp any real essence that would explain why. For all we can tell, maybe tomorrow they'll stop going together. Maybe tomorrow we'll encounter something with all the properties of gold, except that instead of being yellow, it's green with pink polka dots. Or, instead of being heavy, it's lighter than water. But in every other respect, it's the same. Who knows? How can you know? Says Locke. Well, of course, as a nominalist, you can't. You're confined simply to observing what's before you. The upshot is, for Locke, all observational knowledge, all empirical knowledge is at best probable. Now you might ask, why is it even probable if we can't grasp any necessity? Why is there even some likelihood that the combination of qualities that we encountered so far will continue tomorrow? Well, that's exactly the question Hume asked. And in the answer, he wiped out cause and effect and said there isn't even any probability. Now you see how on issue after issue, Locke's formulations lay the basis for the worst skepticism which is going to break out shortly after. Now I should make clear that Locke himself was not a skeptic. He is teeming with the seeds of skepticism, but the seeds did not grow into a full David Hume in Locke. In fact, if we conclude now our very brief summary of Locke's metaphysics and epistemology, the best thing to say is that he is not anything consistently. There are three separate philosophic strands in Locke, all in conflict with the others, all popping up repeatedly and clashing in his discussion of various philosophic questions. And the three strands, as I would identify them, of course he doesn't, are: one, there's a large hunk of Cartesian rationalism. For instance, Locke's emphasis on intuitive and deductive, clear and distinct truths. The fact that he begins with the cogito, the prior certainty of consciousness, the idea that we perceive only our own ideas, and so on. Then, two, there's a definite element of Aristotelianism in Locke. And that's real, and you must know about it. He did have a real respect for this world. And even though a devout Christian, the supernaturalism, overt mysticism doesn't appear in him, in his philosophy. And as part of his Aristotelianism, he insists on the senses as the base of knowledge, even granted his views on the nature of the senses. And his insistence that the unit of reality is the individual, the particular, the concrete, and his emphasis on reason, and his view of reason as the faculty which operates on sense perception. All of this and very important ideas are Aristotelian. And then finally there is the Hobbesian nominalism and all of the skeptic elements that it led to in Locke. So in effect, to put in a crude mathematical formula something which can't be quantified, I would say Locke is 1 part Descartes, 1 part Aristotle, 1 part Hobbes. Which means if you put it more deeply, 1 part Plato, 1 part Aristotle, 1 part sophists. All blended and glossed over by British common sense. Now this combination obviously cannot survive. And the first thing to go was the Aristotelianism, because you cannot survive, it couldn't survive within the framework of a mixture of Descartes and Hobbes. And of course, with only Descartes and Hobbes left, and the rationalist approach discredited via the constructions of Spinoza and Leibniz, the end result had to be what it was, assuming nobody else came on the scene, namely the final triumph of complete skepticism in David Hume, as you'll see. So much for Locke's metaphysics and epistemology. Now let's say a couple of words, and I mean a couple, on Locke's ethics. In ethics, as in metaphysics and epistemology, Locke is an eclectic mixture. And again, you can distinguish 3 main strands in his viewpoint, all helter-skelter tossed off. In part, he's a hedonist, a psychological hedonist and an ethical hedonist. Remember, a psychological hedonist is the view that all men live for pleasure, that that's a law of human nature. And it was a standard Greek view, even though it's erroneous as a universal observation. And an ethical hedonist is someone who says, and they should live for pleasure. Pleasure is the good. The test of right and wrong is maximizing pleasure. Whatever acts lead to the greatest amount of pleasure are right. And there is this definite hedonist element in Locke. But then, over and above that, you have to remember Locke is a devout Christian. And he often says that God is the author and creator of morality, and that God has commanded his creatures to live a certain way, and therefore virtue means obedience to the divine commandments. Now you see this incredible mixture of ancient hedonism and medieval Christianity. And then there's still a third element, which is his heritage from the rationalists. He accepts to a certain extent the typical rationalist view that ethics can be demonstrated geometrically. In other words, that from the very nature of certain concepts, you can establish good and evil strictly deductively, without reference to God or pleasure, simply by reference to the laws of logic. Now, how does Locke combine all these elements? Well, he doesn't really. But if you had to, the view would be something like this. Ethics means obeying the commands of God. And God commands us to behave as long-range hedonists. And since God is rational, so are his commandments, and they're therefore geometrically demonstrable. That's the closest I can make a synthesis out of Locke's ethics. And I won't comment further on such an incredible mixture. You see that Locke's ethics, like his metaphysics and epistemology, is an incongruous mixture of the most diverse elements. Now, in conclusion, let us turn to Locke's politics, by far the most famous branch of his philosophy, and a direct, extremely important influence on the founding fathers of this country. Now, before I utter any reservations about Locke's politics, and I do certainly have many, I want to say the good things about it first, and it does have many profoundly good things. The constituent elements of Locke's politics are not always original with Locke, but he was the first man in Western philosophy to bring them all together and give the theory of inalienable individual rights its first comprehensive influential statement. Now, his famous work on politics is the Second Treatise of Government, which was published in 1690. And in it, It's a rather brief book. He argues forcefully against any form of political absolutism and in favor of individual rights and strictly limited government. And the man he has in mind, although he doesn't mention it, is of course Hobbes. He is out to refute. Now, to synopsize his views politically in the briefest possible terms. I can do it briefly because since this country was founded on these views, you're familiar with them. There is, Locke argues, a natural law, a law of nature, an objective rule defining men's proper social and political relations to each other. This rule derives from God. It is a commandment of God, but it is graspable and provable strictly by the human reason. This part of his politics is obviously the ancient Stoic view that we looked at many weeks ago. Now, the law of nature, according to Locke, is that even before governments exist, in a state that he calls the state of nature, which means simply a condition without government, all men should exist as free, independent, equal beings. And when he says equal, he doesn't mean economically equal or intellectually equal, but equal in one respect only. All possess certain inalienable individual rights granted, in his opinion, by their creator. And those rights are not the right to Medicare, guaranteed employment and 3 months in Florida for your lumbago, but the rights to life, liberty, and property. These rights, says Locke, cannot be interfered with by the government. They do not come from the government. They logically precede the government. And indeed, it is to secure these rights, to enable us to be safe and secure in their exercise, that we should establish governments. That, he says, is why men should make a social compact or contract with one another, to the effect that they will leave the function of protecting rights to the government. They will not attempt to punish criminals, men who infringe their rights by themselves, but will delegate that task to the government. The government, therefore, according to Locke, is not the ruler of the people, but its agent. It simply has the task of protecting men's rights, and above all, their right to the property that they have created by their own labor and which they are therefore entitled to. Government, therefore, he concludes, must be by consent of the governed and must be strictly limited in its functions. Now, why have a government at all? Well, Locke answers that a government gives you 3 great advantages that a state of nature without government would not have. It enables us to live by a code of objective laws that we can appeal to in case of disputes. It provides objective, impartial judges, if you have a decent government, to apply the laws in particular cases, and it has the power to back up the sentences of the judges, to enforce the laws, thereby ensuring that each man will be free and secure within the sphere of his individual rights. So each man, according to Locke, will be able to live by the guidance of his own reason. None will be able to force their views on others. Men, thought Locke, are by and large good. They are rational beings, and here he was in profound opposition to Hobbes. Men do not need an omnipotent ruler to tell them what to do. Left to their own devices by themselves, they can achieve the good life and achieve peace and harmony and happiness on earth. And, he adds, if and when a government begins seriously to abuse its powers, to violate men's rights, to enslave them instead of protecting them, then the people have every right to declare a revolution, to overthrow such a tyrannical government and reestablish the proper, right-respecting kind of government. Now, that is a brief sketch of Locke's politics. Now I think you can see its enormous virtues. In essence, Locke's politics derives from the Aristotelian element in his basic philosophy, from his emphasis on this world, man's reason, the rationality of men, their ability to run their own lives by their own minds, the reality and importance of the individual. The 2 other elements in Locke, the mystical i.e. the Cartesian Christian side, and the skeptical, the Hobbesian nominalist side. They are there in Locke, but they are largely implicit in him. He was stopped from making them the dominant or explicit themes of his philosophy, and consequently they do not break out in substantial ways in his politics. That is the explanation why Locke, with his incredibly mixed philosophy, could have so comparatively good a politics. But these other elements are present in his philosophy. And as you know, the subsequent course of philosophy consisted of suppressing the Aristotelian element in Locke altogether and of transmitting to later centuries only Platonism and skepticism in progressively more intense forms. And the result was, of course, that Locke's politics could not last. Politics cannot stand by itself. It depends directly on ethics and still more basically on metaphysics and epistemology. As the metaphysics and epistemology, and therefore the ethics of later philosophers, turned violently Platonist, skeptic, Kantian, the result was that approval of Locke's ideas dropped off sharply among philosophers and intellectuals, and cultural trendsetters, so that by the time you reach the 19th century, intellectually speaking, Locke's politics were swamped, overcome altogether by every variety of a proliferating collectivism, largely generated by the derivatives of Hume and Kant, Hegel, Marx, and a whole unholy crew thereafter. Now this is why Locke's politics, with all its virtues, could not endure. What would make it endure? Only a complete systematic rational philosophy across the board in every key branch and issue of philosophy. That, unfortunately, is what Locke did not provide. Now, I don't want to imply by my praise of Locke's politics that as he formulated it, it is completely free from objections, even just the politics alone. You cannot escape your metaphysics and epistemology. If something is only a partial element, it will show up in your conclusions. And Locke's confused metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics did have some influence even on his politics. You see, for instance, his references to God as the source of natural law, the source of man's rights. That's a Christian influence on his politics. And if we had time, I could give you many other examples of errors in Locke's politics. Cases where his formulations are inexact or dubious or outrightly dangerous. Cases where his doctrines on matters of detail or implementation leave the door wide open for the modern socialist to plunge in with both feet and wreak havoc. Cases where his mixed-up philosophy leads him to glaring contradictions. But these details are not really important to us this evening. If you read Locke's second treatise of government, and given your background knowledge of objectivism, you can easily spot for yourself, on the basis of what we've said this evening, what is essentially correct and where the formulations go off. For us this evening, I think we have to come to a twofold conclusion. In part, we have to regret deeply that Locke presented his politics in the philosophic framework that he did, because it meant that he never really had a long-range chance to become a permanent influence on the life of mankind. But, nevertheless, we have to express our appreciation to Locke for the excellent elements that are in his politics. Now, true, it's Aristotle who deserves the deepest credit for these elements. And true, Locke made his many errors. But it is nevertheless also true that whatever his errors, Locke is one of the pillars on mankind's road to the discovery of a rational social order. And it's owing to his direct influence that the founding fathers were able to hold the views they did and to create the United States of America. This, I submit, is an achievement for which Locke will and properly should always be remembered. Question: do you recognize any validity in Locke's view of simple ideas? Could you explain where he went wrong with this approach? Well, I explained that I do not believe we are given simple ideas as discrete separate qualities but that they are acts of later analysis. And of course, I'll explain next week, I do not believe we spend our time contemplating our ideas or our experiences. We are directly aware of reality. Objectivism rejects the causal theory of perception in its entirety. So in all those respects, it's wrong. So if you ask me, do I recognize any validity in the idea of simple ideas? Only this much. Not all ideas can be reduced to other ideas. There can't be an infinite regress of definitions. And therefore, there must be some such things as simple ideas. That is to say, ideas of direct sensations, which you get directly from experience and which can only be defined ostensively by pointing to instances of them. I don't always agree with Locke that what he regards as an example of a simple idea is such an example. But the basic idea of simple, unanalyzable ideas, I think, is valid if you don't misuse it in the countless ways Locke does.